let's just do this. Let's start by reading verses 13 through 22 of chapter 25. And then we'll read more after we finish that section. Does anybody want to read those verses? Okay, Gracie. How about, you want to take the next few? Okay, perfect.
Oh, sorry, if you wanted to.
Nope, Gracie,
No, you go
that's,
ahead.
hey, it's all you. Thank you.
Now when several days had elapsed, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea and paid their respects to Festus. While they were spending many days there, Festus laid Paul's case before the king, saying, "There is a man who was left as a prisoner by Felix. And when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews brought charges against him, asking for a sentence of condemnation against him. I answered them that it is not the custom of the Romans to hand over any man before the accused meets his accusers face to face and has an opportunity to make his defense against the charges. So, after they had assembled here, I did not delay, but on the next day took my seat on the tribunal and ordered the man to be brought before me. When the accusers stood up, they began bringing charges against him, not of such crimes as I was expecting, but they simply had some points of disagreement with him about their own religion and about a dead man, Jesus, whom Paul asserted to be alive. Being at a loss how to investigate such matters, I asked whether he was willing to go to Jerusalem and there stand trial on these matters. But when Paul appealed to be held in custody for the emperor's decision, I ordered him to be kept in custody until I send him to Caesar. You said up to verse 22, right?
Mm-hmm. Or continue through 22, yeah.
Then Agrippa said to Festus, I also would like to hear the man myself. Tomorrow, he said, you shall hear him.
Thank you, Gracie. Okay, so in verse 13, we have these two characters come on the scene. A few days later, King Agrippa and Bernice arrived at Caesarea to pay their respects to Festus. I think earlier on, I guess it's there. So I wanted to read in this commentary a little bit of the background information about who these two people were, because I thought it would be helpful to the context of the story. So he writes, Agrippa II, this is him, this guy in verse 13, was the son of Agrippa I, which is the Herod of Acts 12. Born in AD 27, Agrippa II was raised in Rome and became king of Chalcis. You have to fact check me on that pronunciation. In AD 48, when he inherited the throne of his uncle. In AD 53, Agrippa II had the chance to trade his throne for the territories of Philip and Lysanias, including Abilene, Batanea, Trachonitis, and Gaulonitis. And that's references Luke 3, chapter 1. Or Luke chapter 3, verse 1. Then in AD 56, his rule was extended over several more towns around the Sea of Galilee, among which was Caesarea Philippi. Through his territory, though his territories were largely Gentile, he was given by the Romans the right to appoint the high priest. As such, he was known as, quote, the King of the Jews. And then Bernice was the sister of Agrippa II, and had created quite a scandal in Palestine. When she was 13 years old, she married her uncle, Herod of Chalcis. In AD 45, her husband died, and she moved in with the new ruler of Chalcis, which happened to be her brother, Agrippa II. Rumors of her incestuous relationship with her brother spread far and wide. Then in AD 63, she married King Polemon of Cilicia. But the marriage did not last, and soon she was back with Agrippa. Finally, in the 70s, she became the mistress of the Roman general Titus, a relationship which created a huge stir in Rome. Titus apparently considered marrying the beautiful Oriental queen, but when political fortunes made it possible for him to become emperor in AD 79, Titus sent Bernice out of Rome for good. Adam, you joined us at a very peculiar time. I'm sure you're like, what is going on? Are you talking about this brother and sister being married to each other? So this is who this is. A pretty strange relationship between these two. And anyhow, we'll continue on. So they came to pay their respects to Festus, just as the new governor of the area. They were coming to kind of start off on a good foot. Verse 14, since they were spending many days there, Festus discussed Paul's case with the king. He said, there is a man here whom Felix left as a prisoner. When I went to Jerusalem, the chief priests and elders of the Jews brought the charges against him and asked that he be condemned. So they were there for, like it says, like Luke says, many days. So just this extended amount of time, and in that time where they would have been spending time together over meals and such, the discussion of Paul and his trial came up in their conversation. So this greatly interests Agrippa and Bernice, and so Festus starts to explain a little bit about Paul's situation, who he was, and what had just happened pretty recently. So verse 16, I told them that it is not the Roman custom to hand over any man before he has faced his accusers and has had an opportunity to defend himself against their charges. When they came here with me, I did not delay the case, but convened the court the next day and ordered the man to be brought in. So, what's interesting to you so far about his retelling of these events?
Wasn't it vice versa in the original?
What's that?
Wasn't it vice versa? Wasn't it Paul that? Or remember right? Wasn't it Paul that wanted that brought up the?
Yeah, you're on the right track for sure.
He basically made it sound like he's the one that made the decision, when it was actually Paul that made the decision for him.
Yeah. Yeah, he's essentially making himself the hero of Paul's story and trying to puff up his actions like he did this, valiant thing, which is not the case. But in a pretty typical higher official fashion, that's what he did nevertheless. So that's the first fill in the blank here. This is a carryover from last week. But we didn't get to it. So it says, Festus made himself the hero. So those are the first two. Festus made himself the hero in his retelling of Paul's story. Similarly to Claudius Lysias did in chapter 23. If you guys remember that part there, where Claudius Lysias was writing and talking about how he had essentially done the same things, acted in the moral manner that Festus is claiming to have done. You got that, Gracie?
Yep.
Okay. All right, so that was verse 17. When his accusers got up, this is verse 18, when his accusers got up to speak, they did not charge him with any of the crimes I had expected. Instead, they had some points of dispute with him about their own religion and about a dead man named Jesus who Paul claimed was alive. I was at a loss how to investigate such matters, so I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. When Paul made his appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, I ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. So Festus kind of admits that he doesn't have a good idea of why Paul is so hated by the Jews, and he thought that there was some charge against, or at least a more common charge, but maybe a charge against the Roman law that they would have brought him before Festus, because it was a big deal to be brought before Festus. And so he could actually understand what was going on and pronounce a judgment. It would be a pretty clean and clean-cut case. But that's not what happened. And instead, he talked about how this was all in relation to the Jewish law and the Jews, and how they had some kind of disagreement about some guy being alive or dead, which to Festus was probably pretty bewildering. He's just like, why is this such a big point of contention in the first place? So he didn't really understand all that was going on, and he kind of does a little bit what he did before as well. So I was at a loss how to investigate in verse 20 such matters. So I asked if he would be willing to go to Jerusalem and stand trial there on these charges. But what did Luke just tell us about Festus's motivation on why he actually wanted to bring Paul to Jerusalem in the first place? Well, I already mentioned it a few minutes ago. If you weren't in here, you can say. Why did Festus really want to ask if Paul wanted to go to Jerusalem?
He wanted to do a favor for the Jews.
Yeah. Yep. So he was saying that he just didn't know, and he just wanted to get more information, but we we know better. And then verse 21, when Paul made this appeal to be held over for the emperor's decision, ordered him held until I could send him to Caesar. So that is true. That is really what happened, and Festus admits that. Verse 22, then Agrippa said to Festus in response to this, I would like to hear this man myself, he replied. Tomorrow you will hear him. So, he is interested in Paul's case, and I was going to read a little bit from Gareth Reese, which gives us some good info on Agrippa's response to what Festus has just told him. So he says, Agrippa's words show that this is not the first time, he's talking about in Greek, Agrippa's words show that this is not the first time he has heard of Paul, and likely not the first time he has heard of Jesus. The name of Jesus and the apostles would have been familiar in the household of Agrippa II, but he could not lower himself to go hear one of the apostles preach. He could satisfy his long-cherished desire to hear one of these men preach, though, by being part of Festus's invited audience on such an occasion, without diminishing his influence among the Jews. So he's pretty curious about what's going on, and he definitely wants to hear more from Paul and what Paul has to say himself. But at the same time, he doesn't want to be put in a bad light by the Jews. And so this is essentially an easy way for him to do that without coming under too much scrutiny. And then we begin this next section here. So, starting in verse 23. Take it away.
Go to the end of the chapter? Or,
yes, through verse 27.
Okay. So the next day, when Agrippa and Bernice had come with great pomp, and had entered the auditorium with the commanders and the prominent men of the city at Festus's command, Paul was brought in. And Festus said, King Agrippa and all the men who are here present with you, you see this man about whom the whole assembly of the Jews petitioned me, both at Jerusalem and here, crying out that he was not fit to live any longer. But when I found that he had committed nothing deserving of death, and that he himself had appealed to Augustus, I decided to send him. I have nothing certain to write to my Lord concerning him, therefore I have brought him out before you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that after the examination has taken place, I may have something to write. For it seems to me unreasonable to send a prisoner and not to specify the charges against him.
Thank you.
How about that?
Yeah, I know, right? Let's go through this really quickly, because obviously the very interesting part for us is going to be in chapter 26 when we hear from Paul. So the next day Agrippa and Bernice came with great pomp and entered the audience room with the high-ranking officers and leading men of the city. At the command of Festus, Paul was brought in. Festus said, King Agrippa and all who are present with us, you see this man, the whole Jewish community has petitioned me about him in Jerusalem and here in Caesarea, shouting that he ought not live any longer. So everyone's gathered together for this hearing, and Festus begins by emphasizing again, as he's done before, how hated Paul is by the Jews and how they were with I mean, he's talking about the zeal that the Jews have for killing Paul. And this is, we've talked about this before like 12 times, but just how this isn't a very calm, rational trial, the arrest, bringing this guy before the courts. But it was passionate, fiery, they wanted him put to death. And this is the way Festus begins. I found he had done nothing deserving of death, but because he made his appeal to the emperor, I decided to send him to Rome. But I have nothing definite to write to his majesty about him. Therefore I have brought him before all of you, and especially before you, King Agrippa, so that as a result of this investigation I may have something to write. So he's in a little bit of a pickle here, because he's supposed to send this information along with the person, Paul, to Caesar, so that they actually have a good understanding, kind of a base to work from of what's all been going on, and what has Paul actually been charged of, what is he guilty of, what are your findings so far about him, so that they're more informed as they go about it themselves and as Caesar goes about it. So he's in this kind of tight situation. And he says again that this is important for King Agrippa to hear these things. Did I write this down here or later? Maybe it was. I can't remember. Okay, well, I don't remember if I got to it later or not. But anyways, Agrippa is an expert on Judaism. He himself professed Judaism, and he also had a great deal of knowledge about all things Jewish and a lot of the customs and things like that. And so he was a very informed man in that regard. And so the whole intention, as we just talked about, for this hearing to come about is so that King Agrippa can actually understand more about what Paul's position is, and as a Jewish man, or as a believer in Judaism, as a practicing Jew, he would have really wanted to know why this former zealous Pharisee was now talking about all these things about Jesus, and even standing under trial. And not backing down about all these things that he was talking about and was attesting to. So, addressing it to Agrippa. And then we see here as well in verse 26 that this is not an official hearing, that Festus is not sitting on the judgment seat here. He's not actually going to pronounce any kind of judgment on Paul. But this is more of like an investigative deal where they're just trying to find out more information. That's all that's going on. For I think it is unreasonable to send on a prisoner without specifying the charges against him. So, sorry, my mind, you can probably tell, I'm a little all over the place tonight. The second, number 2, fill in the blanks. The hearing for Paul before Agrippa was not to pronounce judgment. The hearing for Paul before Agrippa was not to pronounce judgment. Instead, the purpose was to investigate why he was in prison. Instead, the purpose was to investigate why he was in prison. Verse 27 might sound a little trivial to us, for I think it's unreasonable to send on a prisoner without specifying the charges against him. Gardner here gives us a helpful note on that. To say that it would be unreasonable to send a prisoner without specifying the charges against him is an understatement. It would not only be foolish, and he's speaking of the Greek word there, logos, it could be fatal. This formal report was called oh no. It was called two things, and I can't pronounce them, but it was required. This was important and a necessary document to be sent along to Caesar. And so he notes that this isn't just a trivial thing, like I said, but it could actually be fatal for Festus if he doesn't carry this along. Now we get into 26. Oh man. This is such a good chapter. Does anybody want to read verses 1 through 8? Jerry?
Then Agrippa said to Paul, "You have permission to speak for yourself." So Paul motioned with his hand and began his defense. "King Agrippa, I consider myself fortunate to stand before you today as I make my defense against all the accusations of the Jews, and especially so because you are well acquainted with all the Jewish customs and controversies. Therefore I beg you to listen to me patiently. The Jews all know the way I have lived ever since I was a child, from the beginning of my life in my own country and also in Jerusalem. They have known me for a long time and can testify, if they are willing, that according to the strictest sect of our religion, I lived as a Pharisee. And now it is because of my hope in what God has promised our fathers that I am on trial today. This is the promise our 12 tribes are hoping to see fulfilled as they earnestly serve God day and night. O King, it is because of this hope that the Jews are accusing me. Why should any of you consider it incredible that God raises the dead?"
Thank you, Jerry. So beginning there in verse 26, we begin to see Paul's defense of sorts. It says, "Then Agrippa said to Paul, 'You have my permission to speak for yourself.'" So Paul motions with his hand. In two of his speeches earlier in Acts, he has done this, where he's motioned with his hand. But the Greek word in both of those instances is one where he's calling for silence and is asking his audience to be quiet and listen. Here, that is not the same Greek word, and what he's actually doing is either some sort of salutation or a gesture to affirm the authority of what he's about to say. So this is a little bit different here, and he's saying that what he has to say is important and comes with authority. Motioned with his hand, he began his defense. "King Agrippa, I consider myself fortunate to stand before you today as I make my defense against all the accusations of the Jews, and especially so because you are well acquainted with all the Jewish customs and controversies. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently." We've seen the beginning of speeches and these addressing to the authorities a few times so far, and they've been different content between Paul and others. So how would you describe this greeting from Paul to Agrippa?
Respectful.
Respectful? Yep.
Formal.
Formal? Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Just basically asking not to be interrupted, let hear me out,
Mm-hmm.
type thing.
Yeah. What have we seen before from some of the other greetings of non-believers to the authorities?
Kind of more like a listen you.
Yeah, when they're trying to appeal to someone who's in charge of the judgment, who's presiding over the that specific day, we see pretty, well, language that contains a lot of flattery, right? They're just trying to, it's a way to, I guess, kind of soften them or appeal to their pride or hubris or something along those
The
lines.
ego.
Yeah, right. And we know that's wrong. And so what Paul does here, I mean, Sean, I think you're right on, that it was respectful. It did show honor to Agrippa, as he knew that he was in charge. And at the same time, everything Paul said was truthful. I mean, it was he expressed what he felt about the situation in a truthful way. I consider myself fortunate to stand before you today to make my defense against all the accusations of the Jews, and especially so because of what we just talked about this, because you are well acquainted with all the Jewish customs and controversies. Therefore, I beg you to listen to me patiently. So he knows that Agrippa has a good understanding about the customs of Judaism, some of the belief systems, the practices, and all of these things. And so he thinks that this is a good person to hear it from him, what he's about to say. And so that's it's a pointed definition from Paul as opposed to unbelievers in the way that they address someone, which I respect a great deal, even in a position where he could have done more and tried to put himself in a better light before Agrippa. He didn't do that, and instead he spoke the truth, whether that be helpful to him or not. And he's going to continue speaking the truth, as we'll see. Oh, this is weird. I should have put 3 as... We'll skip 3 for a second. This is 3a. His address to Agrippa was respectful and truthful, but it contained no flattery. His address to Agrippa was respectful and truthful, but it contained no flattery. So continuing on verse 4 there. The Jews all know the way I have lived ever since I was a child, from the beginning of my life in my own country and also in Jerusalem. Paul appeals to the fact that he is not an unknown figure in the nation, in the nation of Israel. He says that, I mean, he's been there, he's known people, and the Jews know him. They've known him for a long time. They've seen him grow up as a young Jewish boy and be trained in the way, and obviously that resulted in an incredibly zealous Paul or / Saul, and that these people know about him. This is not just some figure that popped up on the radar and who they're just targeting. This is somebody that they have some history with. The Jews do. Verse 5, they have known me for a long time and can testify, if they are willing, that according to the strictest sect of our religion, I lived as a Pharisee. We just said this, but when we read it earlier in Acts about some of Paul's deeds, which we'll go on to list a little bit more detail here, right in this chapter. But Paul was distinguished. He wasn't just some random Jew, but he was a distinguished Jew who was one of the most intense Pharisees there were. He was a Pharisee of Pharisees, as he described himself in another book. So he's kind of setting himself up here, saying that this is who I am. You know, I am a Jew, and these are the things that I did, in ways that I'd acted. And now, this is verse 6, and now it is because of my hope in what God has promised our fathers that I am on trial today. Sort of brings it all home just in that quick sentence that we have here. That he's not you can probably see what he's doing, but he's not separating himself from the Jews in this way, saying that, and here I cut off my Jewishness, and that's over here, and all the Jews have that, and now I'm on this other side, totally just completely separated from Jews and all that's going on with them, and now I'm this Christian man, and I'm doing all these things. Instead, what he does is, in not as many words, what he talks about in his letter to the Romans, in other scriptures, that essentially Christ is the fulfillment of the law, not something that's opposed to it in any manner. And so this is the argument that he's making. He begins right here with that, and he's going to continue on with it. But he starts off by saying, and now it is because of my hope in what God has promised from the Hebrew Scriptures, right? From the Old Testament Scriptures that he studied growing up, that he knew deeply and had memorized. That this man, Jesus, was the one who God had promised, and this he had set his hope in, and this is why he is on trial today. Which is kind of ironic, because essentially what he's saying is, I'm on trial today for being a really good Jew. He is being obedient to the law and the prophecies, and actually believing that God sent the Messiah, which he had, of course. So we can read that knowing that it is kind of humorous in a whole way. Verse 7, this is the promise our 12 tribes are hoping to see fulfilled as they earnestly serve God day and night. O King, it is because of this hope that the Jews are accusing me. So he goes really one step further, and the whole point of saying that our 12 tribes is to essentially talk about bring a universal tone to the matter when he's talking about how all of these tribes, all of them together, at points in history, some were against each other, greater than others, and things like that, or at least some of them thought that way in the Old Testament. And what he's saying is that all of, the whole nation of Israel, every Jew that exists, Jew by blood, this is, and professing Jews, this is the hope that has been, that they were hoping to see fulfilled and has been fulfilled, like we said, in Jesus. And these are people, like he says, who are earnestly serving God day and night. So they're working hard for this. And in Paul's eyes, he's here. O King, it is because of this hope, he reiterates it, that the Jews are accusing me for being a Jew. Why should any of you consider it incredible that God raises the dead? So, you guys remember the difference, one of the differences between the Sadducees and the Pharisees? Jamie, you're nodding your head. What is it?
Well, one believed in resurrection and the other didn't.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. So, this idea of resurrection, which was the belief of the Pharisees, that would actually happen, the resurrection of the body. He's making the point that this is already part of our belief system in the first place. This is already a notion that they recognized. And so the fact that God has done this to this man Jesus, as Paul will testify, why is that a big deal at all? I think, I'm trying to remember if he says something neat there. He says, Gareth Reese says about this verse 8, the Greek reads, if God raises dead, parentheses, people. There's no article in the Greek, and dead is plural. A similar construction in Romans 1:4 certainly includes the resurrection of Jesus, and that is involving the resurrection of all men. And that would seem to be the point here. The great truth to which Paul has been building is that Jesus although crucified, was at that moment living and seated at the right hand of God, proven by his resurrection to be the Messiah, the very one the Jews were looking for to fulfill their hope. Jews might believe in the idea of resurrection as part of their doctrine, then why could they not accept the well-authenticated resurrection of Jesus? So, he said it in a lot better way than I could. But that's the beginning of Paul's point here. And what we're going to see, this is number 3, the fill in the blanks, that Paul's defense before...
Is this the original 3 or 3B or?
This is original 3, OG 3.
Okay.
3, good point, Gracie. 3, Paul's defense before Agrippa was essentially just a sermon. Paul's defense before Agrippa was essentially just a sermon. Because he's preaching here, and he will. We'll see it next week too. It's so good. He's so good at this. It's crazy.
Where did the old Jews get the idea of resurrection anyway? I don't know of anything in their first 5 books that would lead them to have that idea.
Well, I mean, I think if we look at the entirety of the Old Testament scriptures, there was an idea presented a few times. I mean, I think of some of the Psalms that talk about being with the Lord. That idea did exist, and I can't remember the specific Old Testament references where it talks about physical resurrection. I would have to go back and kind of look that up. I don't have it off the top of my noggin, but it was a well-established doctrine for that sect, the Pharisees. I mean, it was a pretty widely held belief for them. But the Sadducees, I mean, if you remember too, that they didn't just, it wasn't just the resurrection. They denied very explicit Old Testament material about like the angels and the spiritual world and things like that. And that wasn't, obviously, that's beyond the physical. And so there were other matters that even we can read the Old Testament and be like, huh? How could you come to that understanding? But so there were a few things different with them as well. So as far as Jews go up to that point, I think the Pharisees had a better understanding of the Old Testament. Anyhow. The 3B is, his argument was that, oh my goodness, sorry, that is...
Tongue twister,
That
isn't
he
it?
was in custody.
The argument was that he was in custody, right? And cross out that second was, it's a he. His argument was that he was in custody for believing in who the Hebrew Scriptures had foretold would come. His argument was that he was in custody for believing in who the Hebrew Scriptures had foretold would come. I figured that was a decent stopping place because I didn't think we would be able to get through a lot of Paul's defense/sermon, which extends to verse 23 before he's cut off. And I really didn't want to break it up because I think the next verses leading up to there are just wonderful. So good. So we're going to stop there for tonight, which it's a little bit early, which is a novel thing for us, to be honest. But we have a few minutes if you guys have any questions or comments about tonight or things you noticed that we didn't talk about while we were reading?
Well, I was thinking about the Sadducees and how they didn't believe in resurrection. Or, and just, it's like, why are you even doing the law thing? What's in it for you?
I know, it is sort of confusing in a way, isn't it? Yeah. And those were just the notable differences. I don't think that conveys the entirety of them, but, you know, it is interesting. Any others? We're all tired tonight. I understand. All right, well, hey, praise God. We finished a little early. Does anybody want to close us in prayer?
Sure, Ross.
Thanks, Bill.
Lord, we thank this time of study and our chance to have fellowship and just see everyone. We ask you to bless us as we head to our homes tonight. We pray in Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.